Hi everyone, Effie here. I'm back today to show you 5 techniques that you can use to get some chic results with our large brushed letter sentiment sets. I've gone ahead and placed my large brush thanks on a large acrylic block and I'm inking it up with some hot tourmaline dye ink. Then I'm going to stamp my card panel and then I'm going to ink up the sentiment one more time with the same ink and then stamp the sentiment just one more time because I want a nice dark and crisp impression. So I'm showing you 5 techniques today, but I'm not making any finished cards with the exception of one of the techniques, which I will show on camera later. But for this one, I'm just showing you how to get that ombre effect. After I have my crisp stamped impression down, I'm just going to take our Hampton white pigment ink and I'm going to ink up the bottom of my sentiment. I'm only inking up the bottom of the large sentiment and I'm going in at an angle with my pigment ink pad. I'm going in at an angle because I don't want any harsh lines because I want that kind of dissipated look. And this is just what the ink looks like on the actual stamp. Now I'm just going to take the stamp and stamp it directly over my already stamped impression. And it's easy to do this because we are using clear stamps and that already initially stamped thanks is in a dark ink. So this is the first technique that I'm showing you to get an ombre effect with just regular white pigment ink. Now I'm going to take it a step further and show you the second technique. Because the pigment ink, our Hampton white pigment ink, is a pigment ink, it stays wet a little longer than a dye ink. So I'm just going to go ahead and spoon on some gold glitter embossing powder. I'm using Ranger Gold Tinsel embossing powder. Then I'm just going to take my heat gun and melt all of that embossing powder. And so for this technique, it's important that you go in at an angle with your pigment ink that you're using so that you can get that stardust look when you're using your glitter embossing powder. So here's what my finished panel looks like. I didn't get as much of the stardust effect that I wanted. This is the original panel that I did and I like this effect much more. So I think I was maybe a little less heavy-handed with my pigment ink. So if you want that more dissipated look, that more loose stardust look, use less pigment ink. Next, I'm going to show you my third technique, which I'm calling hard line embossing. And it's really just kind of a harsh straight line going through half of the large sentiment. So for this technique, I'm using our large brushed Hello sentiment. And first, I'm inking it up in our Grand Fuchsia dye ink. And I'm just making sure that I ink up most of the top of the sentiment because the bottom half is going to be covered with embossing powder. So after I cleaned off my stamp, I'm taking a piece of scrap paper with a nice straight edge and I'm going to line it up so that half of my sentiment is covered. And you can use grid lines on your acrylic block if your block has grid lines, but if it doesn't, just try your best. So I covered up half of the sentiment and then I inked up that exposed half with Versamark ink and then I'm just going to stamp right over the sentiment and again it's easy to see through the clear stamp. Next I'm just going to spoon on some gold embossing powder. I'm using Ranger Gold. Next, I'm just going to brush away any stray embossing powders with my paintbrush. Some of the powder did cling onto the top portion of my sentiment because I guess the dye ink just stayed kind of wet. So you can just brush it away with your paintbrush. If you have like a square mini paintbrush, it's easy to do this. Now I'm just going to zap the panel with my heat gun to melt all the embossing powder. So this was the third technique. Hard line embossing. I hope you guys like this technique. Now, this is a close-up look at the finished panel. And now for my fourth technique today, I'm going to show you what I call tone-on-tone ombre. I'm using the same Hello sentiment and Grand Fuchsia ink. However, I'm inking up the bottom portion of my sentiment this time, and I'm going in at the same angle that I did for the white pigment ink from my earlier technique. Since we're doing an ombre effect, I don't want the Grand Fuchsia covering one letter totally, so I just take a paper towel and I'm dabbing away at the top portions of those totally covered letters. Next, I'm taking our Orchid crush ink and I'm inking up the top portion of our sentiment. But since Orchid Crush is lighter than the Grand Fuchsia, you can go ahead and ink up the entire sentiment with the Orchid Crush and just stamp over the already Grand Fuchsia stamped Hello. Then you won't end up with any bare spots on your ombre sentiment. I will be turning this panel into a card after I show you the last technique, so stick around for the end of the video. My fifth and last technique that I'm showing you today is watercolor effect stamping. I'm taking a number 42 Zig marker, which is turquoise green, and I'm just coloring in our brushed happy sentiment. After I colored the entire stamp, I'm going to spritz the stamp with my spray bottle. I'm holding it about 1.5 feet above the stamp and I'm giving it about 2 to 3 spritzes. You don't want to spritz too much water because then it just gets runny. Next, I'm going to clean my work surface and then I'm going to stamp my sentiment onto a watercolor panel. I'm using Canson XL. In hindsight, I should have used better quality paper because after I stamped the sentiment, it did bleed a little. I am going to try this technique out on some better watercolor paper to see if I get better results, but until then, it isn't too bad. So I hope you guys enjoyed watching the 5 techniques that I've used on our 3 large brushed sentiment sets. Now I'm going to make a finished card using the Tone on Tone Ombre panel. I'm just taking our new floral border stamp and I'm inking it up with our soft Orchid dye ink. Next, I'm going to take my ombre panel and just lay it right over our floral border stamp. And it doesn't matter that the hello is already stamped there. Since we're using the soft orchid, it's not really going to show up or interfere with the sentiment. Next, I'm going to take about 1/8 of an inch on the top and the bottom of the panel. I did start out with an A2 size panel. Next, I'm going to apply some gold glitter tape onto the top and bottom edges of that card base. I always have to add some sort of gold element into my card, so if it's not in the form of embossing powder, it's going to be gold glitter tape. Next, I'm going to just adhere down the panel onto my card base, and after this, I'm going to adhere some Queen's Pink sequins right onto the card. And I'm using all the sizes that we have in stock, which is 8, 6, and 4 millimeter. And that finishes the card for today. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. I had a lot of fun coming up with the different techniques, so thanks for watching and I will see you next time. Bye!